Pastor and author John Ortberg tells about a time in his life when he came face to face with the suffering of this world. He was in seminary when he went to visit a state-run convalescent hospital, and he says that it was full of people who were basically waiting to die, people who were suffering and senile and lonely, and they were just waiting to die. And so he goes on this Mother's Day to try and spread a little joy to some of the ladies there, and he met a woman named Mabel. And when he met her, she was strapped to a chair. Her face was being eaten by cancer, so she drooled constantly. Can you think of a time where you came face to face with the pain and the suffering of this world? We live in denial of it. We do our best not to look directly at it. We change the channels as quickly as possible when we're confronted with it. But there comes a point where you just can't get away from it, maybe because you witness it, maybe because you experience it. But eventually, you come to the conclusion that there is a lot of hurt, and there is a lot of suffering, and there is a lot of pain in this life. Now, we do our best to numb it and to escape it, but eventually, you can't get away from it. So in Revelation chapter 6 and 7, we're going to read about the suffering of this world as we study the 7 seals of suffering. Now in chapter 5, you'll remember we left off with a scroll that had 7 seals. In chapter 6, these seals are opened, and as each seal opens up, it describes, particularly in the first 4, it describes the suffering of this life. Now, these seals are part of 3 sets of judgment that we're going to study in the book of Revelation. They're the 7 seals, they're the 7 bowls, and the 7 trumpets. Now, some people think that what we're reading here is sequential, that we're reading kind of an order of events that will unfold. I tend to think that what we're reading is John describing the same thing from 3 different angles. It's sort of like if you're watching SportsCenter and they show you a replay and then they show it again from a different angle and then again from a different angle. Seeing it from 3 different camera angles gives you a more complete picture of what's happening. And so I think that's what's happening as John describes these 3 separate sets of judgments, the seals, the trumpets, the bowls. Now, they are different in that the trumpets and the bowls, as we'll study in the next few weeks, they parallel the Egyptian plagues. The seals that we're studying today, they don't. Here's why that's significant. The Egyptian plagues were meant for the Egyptians. In other words, the people of God were not the ones impacted directly by the plagues, so that when the angel of death passed through, you'll remember they had the blood of the lamb on their doorframe and it passed over them. They were not affected. So what we're going to study with the bowls and the trumpets, those are not as clearly meant for the people of God, but what we're studying here in the seals, God's people don't seem to be exempt from this pain and this suffering that's going to be described for us in the next few minutes. Now look, I want to be clear on this. And some of you are already like, what's he talking about? I have no idea what's happening here. And well, that's okay. Just stick with me for a few more minutes. Here's what I want to be clear on. There's a number of different interpretations as to how and when all of this will unfold. We have said in our study of Revelation, we're not going to get overly caught up with different interpretations and eschatological terms because it is endless. And I explained week 1 that my role is going to be like a tour guide where we're going to stop and look, but then I'm going to say we're walking, and we're going to keep moving because we don't want to miss the big picture, the big revelation that God has for us in this book. And so there are a number of interpretations. I just want to touch on some of these. For some of you, others of you are really going to be into this. It just depends. I'm going to move kind of quickly through it, and then you can study some of this on your own if you're interested. All right, so what we're going to be studying about is often referred to as the Great Tribulation. In chapter 7, verse 14, you'll read that phrase, Great Tribulation. What you need to know is the word tribulation is just a generic term. It doesn't necessarily mean a specific set of time or a specific event. Instead, the word here is just great suffering. In fact, as we've studied Revelation, we've already read the word tribulation. It just hasn't been translated that way. It's been suffering. That's all tribulation means. So you hear people talk about the Great Tribulation. It means suffering. It means a time or period of great pressure. Now, there are some people who believe in a literal 7-year tribulation. Now, John does not talk about a great tribulation specifically lasting 7 years. It's not found in the book of Revelation. But some people, taking into account some passages in Daniel, will interpret the tribulation time that we read in Revelation as being specifically 7 years, that it's going to happen before the return of Christ. So they'll believe in some people believe in a 7-year literal time of suffering and tribulation that is coming. Now, within that, there are a number of different camps as to what will happen to Christians during this 7-year tribulation. Now, some people think that before the 7-year tribulation takes place, that there will be a rapture, and that Christians, the church, will meet Jesus in the clouds, and Christians will be exempt from the 7-year tribulation. And so that interpretation is sometimes called pre-trib. You'll hear it referred to that way. It's that the rapture will occur pre-tribulation period. There are other people who interpret it this way. They think that there'll be basically 3.5 years of suffering, tribulation that Christians or the church will be a part of, but then there'll be a rapture about the halfway point before things get really bad. And those people, or that interpretation is usually called mid-trib. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as pre-wrath. And so that's another interpretation or school of thought here. And then there are those who believe that after the tribulation, which may or may not last 7 years, that there will be a rapture and the return of Christ, which will be more simultaneous. That interpretation is typically referred to as post-trib. All right? We could spend weeks kind of breaking down these different arguments and different interpretations. Few things for you to keep in mind. There are reputable theologians who can make pretty strong biblical cases for their particular interpretation. And so if you ask me, what do you believe? What do I think is the most accurate? I mean, if I'm choosing between, if there really is a 7-year tribulation, literal 7-year tribulation, I'm choosing between pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, I'm on team pre-trib. And here's why. Because if A is no suffering, and B is some suffering, and C is lots of suffering, I'll take door number 1, right? Like if I'm listening to 3 different hermeneutical explanations of Revelation and the tribulation and the rapture, I'm going to lean towards that one. Here's what I want you to catch, though: is there are a number of different theologians who can kind of make a case for this biblically. We don't want to get too caught up in that for our purposes here. It can be interesting. I think it can be helpful to study and to learn and to understand some of these things. But it's fairly endless of how you can go down different paths. I read one commentary where the guy wrote, Jesus said we don't know the day or the hour, but it doesn't mean we don't know the week and the month. Okay, well, you're kind of missing the point, right? I mean, he's saying there's a lot we don't know. And so it can be helpful to kind of study these things and see different perspectives. But what I want us to do as we study this together is, again, not look at Revelation as a puzzle to solve, a code to crack, or a calendar to fill in. I want us to get that. What is the big picture? What is the big revelation that Jesus has for us? I think to help us with that, the best thing for us to do in studying this together is to read the text as if we were the early Christians who received this revelation from John. Because there are many who believe that the Great Tribulation is not necessarily a specific 7-year period, but it's what John's readers were experiencing at that time. It's what many people around the world are experiencing right now. See, for John's readers, what John is about to describe, they didn't read these things as a series of future events to interpret. They read these things to be a current reality that they were trying to endure. And one of the things I've discovered in studying Revelation is how you interpret Revelation has everything to do with where you live and what your life is like. Because if you talk to pastors and churches in third world countries and very difficult places where suffering is a way of life, where it's daily, they tend to ask much different questions than many of us in this room would ask. The 2 questions they tend to ask in reading the book of Revelation are the same questions John's readers are asking, and we'll see this in a minute. They're asking, how much longer will it last? Very practical question, right? How much longer will it last, and how can I get through this? How much longer will the suffering or the tribulation last, and how can I get through this? So let's look at chapter 6. We'll start in verse 1. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals, and then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a loud voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." And then another horse came out. It is a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other, and to him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse, and its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And then I heard what sounded like a voice from among the 4 living creatures in heaven, saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard a voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades, or the grave, was following close behind him. And they were given power over a fourth, 25%, a fourth of the earth, to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So these first 4 seals are opened. And each one pushes play on a vision for John, and he sees 4 horsemen riding 4 different horses. So let's look at these different horses. The first horse is the white horse. The rider of the white horse carries, did you catch this? What was it? A bow. And verse 2 says he's bent on conquest. Now, there's no shortage of kind of creative interpretations as to what this rider on the white horse carrying a bow may mean in some future tribulation time, but for John's readers, this was not difficult to understand. Because they had some neighbors to the east, the Parthian warriors, who were the only mounted warriors at the day who were archers. Care to guess what color a horse they rode? White. And so he is describing here, as he describes this rider of the white horse, he's describing military conquest. Military conquest. And I just want you to ask yourself if there's ever been a time in history where the white horse has not been riding. I mean, from Genghis Khan to Nazi Germany, the white horse rides. And that was true then, it is true now. There is the red horse. The red is the color of blood and death. The red horse brings conflict. This rider carries a large sword and disrupts peace. Everywhere he rides, he turns men and women against each other. You need evidence that the red horse rides? Probably not, but if you do, you just turn on the news at any given time and you will see conflict, not just among nations, but among neighbors and in homes. The red horse rides and brings conflict. Then there's the black horse. The black horse rides and brings famine and economic collapse. This always follows wars and conflict. We read about the rider of the black horse carrying scales. Scales were used, of course, to measure economy. They were used to measure food and money. And we read that this rider is carrying scales. And then we read that prices are shouted from heaven, a denarius for a quart of wheat. Okay, what's that mean? Well, a denarius was a day's wage. At that time, a quart of wheat was about a day's worth of food. And so what you read here is that the economy that has collapsed basically allows people to earn just enough to feed themselves for that day. That each day brings about the struggle of, will I have water to drink? Will I have food to eat? Now, the question is, does that describe the world we live in? Does that describe the world we live in? Now, it says also, do not touch the oil and the wine. Well, what's that mean? Well, it means that the people who are wealthy won't be impacted in the same way as the people who are poor. And so what do you find in our world today? That the majority of the population of this planet lives on less than $2.50 a day. That 80% of the population lives on less than $10 a day. That 22,000 children die every day due to poverty. That more than a quarter of the population is considered to be starving to death. So you tell me if the black horse of famine and economic collapse is riding. Leads us to the 4th seal, the 4th horseman riding the pale or the green horse. The pale horse is death himself. The grave follows after him. So there are these first 4 seals that are opened. I want you to catch this. This is both disturbing and comforting, that heaven allows it. Do you catch this with the first horseman He is given a bow. He is given a crown representing power. We read that the horseman riding the red horse is given a sword, that the horseman riding the black horse carrying scales, but where do the prices come from? The prices are shouted down from heaven. So John is reminding his readers this both comforting and disturbing truth, that God may not be causing these things, but he is allowing these horsemen to ride. And even though we don't always understand, even though it doesn't always make sense to us, that God is on his throne and he is still in control even in the midst of tribulation. So again, there's a number of different interpretations as to whether this suffering is coming or is currently being experienced. So a lot of people ask, so is this a coming tribulation or is this already happening? And my answer is yes. Yes. That we live in a time of tribulation, as has been the case since John's readers first received this, and we will continue to, and what we can expect is that things will get worse, not better, before the return of Christ. Now, again, for many of us in this room, we read and we interpret this differently than so much of the rest of the world. Because for many of us, and I know, there are many exceptions, but for many of us, tribulation, we would have a hard time calling the tribulation we experience great. Now, again, I know there are exceptions. I know that some of you have endured more than I could possibly imagine, but I also know that we have a tendency to allow our lives and our disappointment and our frustration to be determined by things that are really quite trivial in the scheme of things. Though I know there are plenty of exceptions in this room, I also know that, and I've spent time with people around the world, that expect the suffering, that they really don't know if they're going to live through the next day. And if you spent time with them, I dare say you would describe what they're experiencing as tribulation, and you would likely put the word great in front of it. And so this is something that we see around the world, and what we can be sure of is that whether there's a literal 7-year tribulation or not, what we can be sure of is that before the return of Christ, things will get bad, and then they'll get worse. We read about the 5th and 6th seal, and they seem to reveal what happens just before the return of Christ. And each seal also reveals kind of a huge question that people ask during times of tribulation. It says, when he opened the 5th seal, this is verse 9, I saw under the altar the souls of those who'd been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained, the martyrs. They called out in a loud voice, how long? There's the question. How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? Then each of them was given a white robe representing victory, and they were told to wait, how long? A little longer, until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. In other words, look, there is a set time here. So you're going to have to wait a little longer. One of the things we've said in this series is that the most common word in Scripture used to describe the return of Christ is the word soon. Soon. How much longer? A little longer. When will he come? Soon. And so for those who are asking how much longer, God says, here's a white robe. Victory is certain. You're going to have to wait a little longer. The 6th seal, verses 12 through 17, seems to describe the end of the world. I watched as he opened the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, and the whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, everyone, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? And so what we're reading here seems to be the end of the world, the day of judgment. The question is, who can withstand it? Who can survive it? Now, some people would say that John is witnessing here a nuclear holocaust, and he's just trying to describe it in images that make sense to him. And so he talks about stars falling from the sky, but those are nuclear-tipped missiles. And the sun becomes black, but that's a result of dust and debris from nuclear blasts. And the atmosphere is being pushed apart, John describes, but that's a nuclear explosion. I don't know, maybe. But whatever the case, here's what's clear. Everything is destroyed. Everyone is affected by the 6th seal. And the question that we're left with is, who can stand? Now, how are we going to get through this? And so in Revelation chapter 6, we read about this suffering, we read about this tribulation, but in chapter 7, there's this news bulletin about the future. John paints this picture in heaven of what one day will be for all those who have, all those who are, and all those who will suffer. And in Revelation chapter 7, he says, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they were wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell down on their faces before the throne, and they worshiped God, saying, "Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen." And so John paints this picture of great victory, of a great celebration where people are wearing the white robes of victory and waving palm branches indicating victory, and they're singing, "Salvation belongs to our God." So here it's coming. The war is technically over. You've got some days left where those in charge may not have yet realized it, but it's over. And so he describes this celebration. Look at verse 15, 17. "Therefore, they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence, and never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst, and the sun will not be down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." And so John says, look, here's what is coming. And so what is the message here? I mean, I know there's a lot that we can get caught up in. There's a lot of different terms and interpretations. But the message of Revelation continues to be quite simple. If you are not ready, get ready. Because Jesus is coming. If you are struggling and you are experiencing tribulation, then hold on, because Jesus is coming. John Ortberg tells about going to see Mabel. And he said, "Well, what do you think about Jesus?" And she said, "Oh, I think about how he has been awfully good to me in my life." And she said, "Jesus is all the world to me." And she began to sing the old hymn, "Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He is my strength from day to day. Without him I would fall." Mabel understands Revelation, that Jesus is our hope. So get ready and hang on, because his coming is sure and his coming is soon.